Welcome to another episode of Mike's Money Picks. Today on the podcast, we're going to be breaking down the Monday, January 29th slate of college basketball at DFS. We have got a big Monday slate, which for whatever reason, ESPN seems to be going lighter on the big Monday slates this year. We only have a two-game slate here on DraftKings as well as FanDuel. We've got Duke taking on Virginia Tech, and we've got Texas taking on Houston. So it's two pretty good games, all things considered. Two games that are going to be nationally televised. But, a two-game slate is a little bit smaller than what we're used to from a DFS perspective. So we are going to break down both these games, tell you kind of what angles you can be attacking each of these games, and kind of tell you where you can expect the scoring and the fantasy scoring to come from for both these games. So, with it being a smaller slate, we do get to give a little bit more detailed breakdown, but the lineup construction from a DFS perspective is also different. So hopefully we're going to be able to give you guys plenty of information here on this episode that is going to allow you to build some winning lineups on DraftKings as well as FanDuel. Now, if you are new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. That way you can be with us for the rest of the college basketball season. If you're listening on audio, subscribe to the audio feed as well. Whether you listen on Spotify, Apple, or wherever else you get your podcast, you can subscribe on there as well as rate and review. And if you are watching on YouTube, please hit the like button. It really does help me out a lot. Helps the videos get noticed, helps the channel grow, and I really do appreciate it. You guys are the best. All right, so let's go ahead and end the introduction right there, and let's go ahead and dive into this two-game slate. All right, so I do want to get this part out of the way before we start breaking down the Duke-Virginia Tech game. Lineup building on a two-game slate is going to be a little bit different from lineup building from how you would expect it on a 8 or 10 or 12-game slate. So first off, there's just not a whole lot of options out there. So you're very unlikely to like all of the plays that end up in your lineup. In fact, if you do genuinely like all 8 plays that are in your lineup, then that's probably too good to be true, or it probably means that all 8 of those guys are going to be super highly owned, and you need to find a way to get different. So one thing I would recommend big time is build with a narrative in mind. Like, for instance, this slate, Kyle Filipowski is the highest price count on the slate. Well, if I'm playing Filipowski, I'm going to build my lineup around what would likely happen, who else would likely go off or not go off if Kyle Filipowski is going off. And so I would just kind of consider that as well. I think the inverse is also true. Like if I'm playing a value play, what stars would not be going off if this value play is playing extra minutes or getting extra fantasy points. And then also find a way to be different. On a two-game slate, it's very easy to have a duplicate lineup as someone else just because there's not as many options. So playing a low-owned guy or not using all of the salary cap, stuff like that is going to enable you to be different if you don't want to be duplicated in some of these GPPs. I do know some people out there that they don't mind being duplicated because their goal is to find the optimal lineup. And I think that's a legitimate strategy. But also, if you want to win more money, even if you hit the optimal lineup, it's going to have to be different. So let's go ahead and break this first game down. Duke is heading to Plattsburgh to take on Virginia Tech. KenPom has this one projected to be 75 to 73 in favor of Duke. So a 148-point total, which is the higher game total on this slate by 16 points. In fact, the high totals make it so that way these are the 2 highest scoring projected teams on the slate, according to KenPom. So this is probably going to be the game where if you're looking to game stack, or if you're looking, just from a mathematical basis on who's more likely to hit value, theoretically, it's going to be more likely for the guys in this game to hit value than the guys in the other game because the game total is higher by 16 points. That's a pretty substantial amount. And when you look at the tempo ratings, that bears it out. Duke ranks 159th in tempo and Virginia Tech ranks 166th in tempo, which are both faster than both Houston and Texas. So to me, this game bears itself out to, I would most likely be building my lineups, getting at least 4 guys from this game. I certainly don't want to be undervalued on this game or have more plays from the second game, the Houston versus Texas game. Now, on the Duke side, Kyle Filipowski is the only player above 8K on DraftKings. He is still also the highest priced player on FanDuel as well. And when you look at what he did against Clemson, he dealt with foul trouble. And he only played 24 minutes, but he still had a 37% usage rate in that game, meaning when he was out on the floor, they were still using him actively in the offense quite a bit. And he has a 29% usage rate on the season. I think he is a solid play. I think he does have to stay out of foul trouble, though. I think that's a little risk that you carry when playing Filipowski, but I definitely think that the opportunity is there. And even though he is the highest price guy on the slate, it's pretty darn likely that he's going to reach value. I mean, you just look at his game log. In 3 of his last 5 games, he scored 40 3 fantasy points or more, which is not quite 5x value, but is well over 4x value. And so I do think that this is a decent spot for Filipowski. Now, on the rest of the Duke team, we mentioned Filipowski being in foul trouble. Well, who did that end up benefiting? Well, Ryan Young did play a boosted minutes in that game from Filipowski's foul trouble, but he only played 17 minutes total. He only took 1 field goal, and he only put up 5.5 fantasy points. That's not good. If you're playing him at 4,200, even if you get the Filipowski foul trouble, you want more than 5.5 fantasy points. If you're looking at the game long, keep in mind that, the Pitt and the Georgia Tech game were games where Mark Mitchell was not active, so Ryan Young was called on to play the 5 a little bit more. So I don't think this is a great spot for Ryan Young. If you're building your lineup with Filipowski foul trouble as a narrative, he might be a guy that you can put in it. So I obviously would not play him with Filipowski. Mark Mitchell is a guy that theoretically would benefit from Filipowski foul trouble because theoretically, it would give Mitchell a little bit more usage on the inside of the offense. It would give him a little bit chance at higher rebounding rate, but that didn't really bear itself out. He only had 23 fantasy points in that game against Clemson, but he does have some ceiling games. He's had over 40 fantasy points multiple times this season, and it generally comes from his high rebounding total games. So, where would those high rebounding total games come from? It would come from a massive pace-up spot, which this is not, where it would come from a poor rebounding team, which this is not. So I don't think this is the best spot in the world for a Mark Mitchell ceiling game, but to kind of continue on with what I've been saying, I don't think I would play Filipowski and Mitchell or Young together. I think I would kind of make my stand between playing one of those 3 guys. Now, for the guard spot, this is where Duke gets interesting. Tyrese Proctor was their usage leader in their last game against Clemson. He played 38 minutes, took 10 shots, had 31 fantasy points, which now makes it back-to-back games with 31 fantasy points. Tyrese Proctor was dealing with an injury for a majority of January, and now he is fully back. He's back in the starting 5. We don't have to worry about him not being full strength. I think this is a pretty solid spot for him at only $7,000. I think he's a very likely candidate to hit at least 4x value in this game. Now, Jeremy Roach was transitioned to the bench with Tyrese Proctor being back in the starting lineup, and he only put up 9 fantasy points in that game against Clemson. But here's the good news. He still played 25 minutes, which is a decent total for him when you look at his full season, and he did still take 8 shots. He just made 1 of them. So if you think, shooting regression is going to be a thing, or if you think Tyrese Proctor is going to find himself in foul trouble, then Jeremy Roach would be a guy that I would, have as a candidate for my lineup. Now, the other guys, Caleb Foster and Jared McCain, they just kind of have these random ceiling games, right? McCain had a huge game against Clemson, 37.75 fantasy points. Caleb Foster, why did I want to call him Cam? Caleb Foster had a ceiling game against Pitt earlier in the month where he had 38 fantasy points. Their ceiling games just kind of come out of nowhere. There's no real rhyme or reason to it. Their usage can be inconsistent as well, and they don't really do a whole lot else outside of scoring. They're probably guys that I would take shots at in a GPP by only playing one of them, but I'm not super interested in either of them. But just know that, to me, they have to make your player pool because they can have a random ceiling game. Now, we've also seen Virginia Tech give up these explosive games to guards. Reese Beekman of Virginia, Nigel Pack of Miami, and Hunter Sallis of Wake Forest have all had big games against Virginia Tech. So I definitely think Duke, attacking from the guard spot is probably going to be key for this game, which makes me want to get Proctor and then maybe a McCain or a Foster into my lineups. Now, on the Virginia Tech side, we got to start off the conversation with Sean Padula, who had a 29% usage rate in every single conference game until the Georgia Tech game on Saturday. So because of that incredible consistency with his usage, Sean Padula is going to be one of my favorite plays on this slate. It's a good pace spot, against this Duke team that plays at a decent tempo. We've seen them give up a decent amount of points to guards, and that usage rate at this price tag, I like it for Padula, and he's shown a massive ceiling. He had back-to-back 54 or more fantasy point games earlier in the season. So why did Padula not have a big usage rate against Georgia Tech? Well, it was because all 3 bigs who play minutes for Virginia Tech had over a 20% usage rate. Lynn Kidd, Robbie Barron, and Mylijel Poteet. So Lynn Kidd dealt with foul trouble. but he still had a massive usage rate when he played. He only played 15 minutes and he was still able to put up 24 fantasy points. That's incredible efficiency. I kind of don't like the idea of him avoiding foul trouble in this one. Both Duke Biggs, Filipowski, and Mitchell draw over 5 fouls per 40 minutes, which is pretty high. So I think it's a quite real possibility that Lynn Kidd finds himself in foul trouble again. But if he stays out of foul trouble, he is a very efficient per minute player who plays generally with a high usage rate. Robbie Barron plays the four for this Virginia Tech team, and he put up 28 fantasy points against Georgia Tech in 26 minutes. And he's been playing some pretty good basketball as of late, but the price tag at $5,500 I think is a little much at this point. But he's an option. And then Malajel Poteet played a season high in minutes, 23, and put up a career high in fantasy points, 30, and a career high in real points, 18, against that Georgia Tech team on Saturday. It was just a perfect storm for Poteet. You had the Lynn Kidd foul trouble, you had the game turning into a blowout, and so I think that I don't necessarily want to chase the Poteet game, but it shows a clear path for a narrative where if Lynn Kidd gets in foul trouble, Poteet's going to play minutes and Poteet's going to get some usage. The rest of the guys for Virginia Tech, the only two I really have interested in are MJ Collins and Hunter Couture. Both of them are kind of just designated shooters. They don't really do a whole lot else outside of shooting, but MJ Collins, back-to-back games, he's taken 21 total shots. He's put up at least 18 fantasy points in both those games. He's only $4,600 on DraftKings. And then you got Hunter Couture, who I don't know if you guys remember the ACC tournament 2 years ago where Virginia Tech kind of won kind of out of nowhere to kind of clinch an auto bid from the ACC when they might not have otherwise got one. But Hunter Couture went off against Duke in that ACC championship game. And he's been pretty solid as of late, put up 26 fantasy points in 3 of his last 4. He has been shooting the ball pretty well, and he is generally a pretty good shooter. And I think that there's a chance that continues because Duke's three-point defense is nothing to write home about. So I think if you're looking to optimally stack this Virginia Tech side, I think it would have to include Padula because he does so much with the basketball in terms of scoring it and assisting it. And then I'd probably pair him with one of the guards, Couture or Collins, and then one of the bigs, Kidd, Barron, or Poteet. And I think, at the end of the day, you're looking to get 4, maybe 5 guys from this game. There's a very simple formula to get 3 Virginia Tech guys, and you have it right there. All right, now the second game of the night is Houston taking on my Texas Longhorns. Now, you'll notice if you're watching on YouTube, I am not repping Texas like I normally do the day before a Texas game. I'm beginning to wonder if that might be bad luck because I am a very superstitious person. So instead, I'm repping my Charlotte 49ers, who are currently in the lead in the American Athletic Conference. Charlotte is the school that I graduated from, but, I always say what I tell people is Charlotte is my school, Texas is my team, because ever since I started watching sports, I've been a Texas Longhorns fan. So I kind of got to stick with that kind of dual fandom through going to Charlotte because Charlotte was never really any good at basketball. And, they never really play each other. So it was just kind of a perfect environment to kind of continue those two fandoms. Anyway, so we do have Houston heading to the Moody Center to take on Texas. This one is the lowest projected total of the slate. Well, obviously it's a 2-game slate. It is the lower of the 2 games. It is projected to be 70-62 in favor of Houston. And it's because Houston is just such a tough matchup to target in fantasy. Like I feel like almost every time they're on a slate, you can just take whoever's playing them and just put a big red X through them and you'll be okay. Houston ranks first in defensive efficiency per KenPom and 350th in the nation in adjusted tempo. That is not a combination that's going to lead to a lot of fantasy scoring, simple as that. Now, on thinking to Texas, I can bring a unique perspective from this game because of pretty much I've gotten to watch every minute of Texas basketball this season, except for the games they play on the Longhorn Network, because as somebody in North Carolina, I don't get the Longhorn Network. And Texas playing BYU on Saturday, they didn't play poorly offensively or defensively. About the only thing they did wrong was they did not shoot the ball well at the foul line. But BYU had a lot of tough shots. But the good news is that Texas was forcing a lot of tough shots defensively. Well, Houston is kind of the same type of team where when I watch Houston, they don't really get a whole lot of quality shots. They really rely on their guards to make a lot of tough shots. So I think this could be a very similar game to what we saw with Texas versus BYU, except Houston a little bit better defensively than BYU and a little bit slower tempo, a little more patient offense than BYU. So this is not a great combination for the Texas Longhorns to target them, in my opinion. Now, so let's go ahead and talk about Houston. So Jamal Shed has got to be the beginning or the end of every stack with this Houston team. He is a National Player of the Year candidate. He is the team leader in usage on the season, and he has a 41% assist rate on the season. If that sounds high, it is. It is in the top 50 in all of college basketball. And you look at his fantasy scoring, he's got a very high floor. I'm not somebody who normally plays cash games, especially on 2-game slates, but he's a guy that you do have to target in cash games, in my opinion, because he does so much with the basketball. He generally gets double-digit shots as well, that he is probably going to get you 4x value at a salary of $7,900. I did forget to mention from the Duke Virginia Tech game, on the FanDuel side, Sean Padula is an outstanding bargain on FanDuel. He's about $1,000 cheaper, and there's a very clear lane to playing him on FanDuel. Now, for the rest of Houston, you have LJ Cryer and Emmanuel Sharp, who are kind of their designated scorers. They can run hot or cold, neither really do a whole lot in terms of the peripheral stats. So, like, you look at LJ Cryer's game log, in his last 5, he has 2 games over 30 and 3 games under 19. So, it's all dependent on whether or not his shot is falling. And the same goes with Emmanuel Sharp. Back-to-back games, he's been over 24 fantasy points, which is really good for his price tag, but he's also had 3 under 16. The difference is with Sharp is like his last 2 games, he's put up 24 and 26 fantasy points, and he shot the ball terribly. He's a combined 4 for 21 from the field in his last 2 games, and he still hit 4x value in both of those games. So I definitely think Emmanuel Sharp is a guy I would play over Cryer, but that's just my personal opinion. The problem with playing both those guys, though, is the fact that they don't really do a whole lot in the peripheral stats, and that's kind of my only gripe with them. Now, for the bench for Houston, Damian Dunn is kind of their primary guard off the bench, and he has a high usage rate off the bench. Like, he does a lot with the basketball when he plays. You just can't really count on his minute total. Like, his best game in conference play was 28 fantasy points against TCU, and he played 29 minutes in that game, which is the high for his conference play stats. But I don't really know why. Like, I can't figure out like a narrative or a reason why he played that game unless Kelvin Sampson was just riding the high hand. So I think he's a decent upside GPP play. I probably would not play him if I was playing Cryer or Sharp, because that probably means that Cryer or Sharp is on the bench with foul trouble or on the bench because they're not playing well. Now, for the bigs for Houston, one more guard they do play, Malik Wilson, plays very sparingly. Maybe he's a GPP play. The bigs for Houston, Juwan Roberts is their primary big man. He is really solid, and he tends to play his best against better competition for whatever reason. He has a solid ceiling at 53 fantasy points in that game against TCU that I have already mentioned. And then he also had 24 last game against Kansas State, which is not bad from a guy at his salary, but not great either. I think he's priced up a little higher than I would prefer, but that ceiling means he kind of has to be priced up here, right? So I don't think this is necessarily the best matchup for him either. Texas is generally pretty stingy to the bigs, especially considering you have to guard Dylan Dessou and Dylan Mitchell on the other end, and it can lead to foul trouble for opposing teams' bigs. So I think Roberts is probably going to be a lower owned DFS play, but don't discount him because he does have that incredible ceiling. Now, Javier Francis, I'm not as intrigued by. He only has a 15% usage rate on the season. He has a significantly smaller ceiling. He has not scored more than 25 fantasy points in a game since night 2 of the season against Texas A&M Corpus Christi. So I would not be super interested in playing Javier Francis. That's just me. I wanted to call him Jesse, like the linebacker. Joseph Tugler is a backup big for them. I think he's really talented. I think he's going to be better than Javier Francis is in the long run, but he's not there just yet. He generally plays between 11 and 18 minutes a game in conference play. I mean, maybe he's an option if you think that Francis and Roberts end up dealing with foul trouble. On the Texas side, they are at a point now where everything in their offense revolves around Dylan Dessou. And I am okay with that, because if you've never watched him, he is a big man who can do it all from the offensive side. Like, what they'll do with him is they will get him involved in a pick and roll, and he is versatile enough that, depending on how the defense plays it, he can turn it into a pick and pop. He can make it a short roll and hit a nice little 10 to 15 foot floater, or he can roll all the way onto the rim and dunk it with the best of them. Like, he's just an elite pick and roll player at the big spot. And that's what their offense has kind of been about since they have gotten him back fully healthy. And I think he's a bargain on both sides, DraftKings and FanDuel. He was at 34 fantasy points against BYU, 43 against Oklahoma. The games that he doesn't do well are the games he finds himself in foul trouble. And these Houston bigs are not really going to force the issue on the offensive end and draw a lot of fouls. So I think that is a recipe for Dylan Dessou. even though it's a terrible matchup against Houston, I think it's a great recipe for him to still be on the floor a lot, which is going to give him an opportunity to put up a lot of fantasy points. Now, outside of Dylan DeSue, when he does get in foul trouble, what you see is Caden Shedrick comes in, but he doesn't see nearly the same level of usage that DeSue does. But hey, if you're going to be fading DeSue, you might want to throw a Shedrick lineup or two out there. Shedrick was really good at the start of the season, filling in for an injured Dylan DeSue. And, if you're playing, like I said, if you're fading DeSue, if you think DeSue, struggles, then maybe it's because he gets in foul trouble and Shedrick could see boosted minutes. Zarik Onyema is the same deal, but they play Shedrick ahead of him. I think Shedrick's a little more developed offensively, my personal opinion. But I do like Onyema. He brings a lot of energy. He's going to be a solid player. But if you're going to be fading DeSue, I would make sure to put Caden Shedrick in some of those lineups. Now for the guards, Max Asmus and Tyrese Hunter both have over a 23% usage rate on the season. The problem with Asmus is that he's pretty shot dependent. Like the games where his shot is not falling, he tends to not have as much fantasy points, like 17 against BYU on Saturday. But the good news is he's pretty much guaranteed a dozen shots. He's gotten as much in every single conference game they have played. And he's a pretty good player, y'all. Like if you remember him in Oral Roberts, he could really fill it up. He could really get hot. It would not shock me to see a Max Asmus like big time game against Houston. And I think that he's a guy that, kind of like I've said about some of these other guys on the slate, his upside means that he has to be in your player pool on this 2-game slate. Now for Tyrese Hunter, he can do a lot more with the peripheral stats, which gives him, what's the right word I'm looking for? More pathways to hitting value from a DFS perspective. Now, he doesn't always get a lot of shots. He doesn't always hit a lot of those shots, but he can generally, steady the total fantasy points by getting rebounds and assists, and he's much cheaper than Max Asmus. I probably wouldn't play both of them together. What generally ends up happening is the games that are more slow down, drag out, half court types of games, Asmus excels because they get him involved in the pick and roll a lot. And in games that get up and down or played at a faster tempo, Tyrese Hunter tends to do a little bit better. And we went over the numbers. This is more likely to be a slower knockdown, drag out type of game, which to me would favor Asmus. Now, the guys that I really struggle to figure out are the rest of the guards and forwards for Texas. So Ithiel Horton has been starting. He's now started in 4 straight games, but he only had one good performance against UCF, and he hasn't been great since then. He's put up a combined 20 fantasy points since then. And then Kendall Weaver, he's much more expensive on FanDuel, so this is a harder decision on FanDuel. But at only $4,300, it feels like you have to play him. Like, he's played 28 and 25 minutes in back-to-back games. He's put up at least 21 fantasy points in both those games, and he's just a glue guy. He's going to play with a lot of energy. He's going to play great defense. He can get some offensive boards. He'll be aggressive, and he'll get to the foul line. Like, there's a lot to like here, especially at a salary of only $4,300 on DraftKings, where there's a lot of value that it just isn't really there. That was a poor way of phrasing that, but there's just not a whole lot of value on this slate. And Kendall Weaver, I think, will be probably the most popular value play on the slate. Brock Cunningham shifted to the bench for the last 4 games and has proceeded to do nothing from a fantasy perspective. Look, he's kind of like Kendall Weaver, except without the scoring. He is a very aggressive player, very good defensive player. Will get a lot of loose balls, will get you some rebounds and occasional assists, but he just doesn't have a very legitimate ceiling from a fantasy perspective. Dylan Mitchell is probably the toughest guy to figure out. If you watch the Texas BYU game, like, they were just kind of leaving him open and daring him to beat them by scoring, and he didn't. He only took 4 shots and he put up 18.75 fantasy points. He is an elite athlete who is a good rebounder and a great dunker and great with the ball in the open court. I kind of feel the same way I did about Tyrese Hunter, where he is better suited for an up and down the floor kind of game. And I don't think that that's what this is going to be. But from a game theory standpoint, from a strategy standpoint, it makes sense. Like, if you don't think DeSue is going to get there, then maybe Dylan Mitchell gets there. That would be the one redeeming reason that I would see to play. All right, and that does it for this 2-game Monday slate on DraftKings as well as FanDuel. If you do want more information from me, there are a few places you can get it. Head on over to on Twitter at Mike's Money Picks. I tweet out any updates for the show, and I'm more than happy to answer any DFS questions or start sit questions on Twitter. I'm also in the Fantasy Corner Discord. Link is in the description on YouTube as well as on the audio feed. I cannot recommend that enough, y'all. We're in there all day, pretty much chatting it up, talking plays, talking strategy, and then when the games actually start, it's time to sweat it out, and it's a lot of fun. If you're looking for people to talk about DFS with, specifically college basketball DFS, but we do other sports in there as well, I cannot recommend it enough. It's just a fun environment to be in. And then if you want to know who actually makes my lineups on these pretty much nightly slates now, head on over to the Patreon, patreon.com/Mike'sMoneyPicks. On the Patreon, I highlight my core plays as well as kind of my lineup strategy and attack strategy for each slate. And I'm not going to sit here and guarantee that you can just buy that and instantly win GPPs. It's not that easy, but it gives you some good sound information that not a lot of people have for college basketball DFS, and it'll just help you build your own process, build your own foundation for building DFS lineups. All right, so that really does it for this episode, guys. So tomorrow night we are likely to do the golf show. So it's one of my favorite golf tournaments of the year this week. So if you want to know what I'm looking at for the Tuesday slate, you're going to want to join the Fantasy Corner Discord, or you're going to want to subscribe to the Patreon, because I will be in the Fantasy Corner Discord talking it up. I will have my core an article on the Patreon, but I'm probably not going to have a full-fledged video for the Tuesday slate. However, you should subscribe to the channel because you can get notified when all the new episodes drop, like our Wednesday, hopefully Thursday, hopefully Friday episodes as well. And then also like the video while you're at it. If you like what you saw in this video, please hit the like button. If you're listening on audio, please rate and review. It helps the video and the podcast gets noticed, which helps grow the community. And I really do appreciate it. You guys are the best. I'm looking to get to 500 subscribers, and the best way to get that is by getting likes up on each video, so that way they can get noticed and more people can subscribe. So with that being said, let's go ahead and end the video there. Hopefully I gave you guys plenty of information that you can use to build some good DFS lineups on this Monday slate. Best of luck to you in all your DFS endeavors, and thank you guys for watching and listening, and I will see you next time.